The morning sun cast long shadows across the Arizona territory as Ayanna crouched behind a cluster of prickly pear cacti, her breath coming in short, silent gasps. The sound of horses and men's voices echoed through the canyon, growing closer with each passing moment. She pressed herself deeper into the rocky outcrop, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it. "She can't have gone far," called out a gruff voice that made her blood run cold. It belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, the man who had destroyed everything she had ever known. Apache women don't just disappear into thin air. 3 months had passed since that terrible night when the soldiers came to her village. Ayanna could still smell the smoke and hear the screams that haunted her dreams. She was the only one who escaped, the only survivor of the Chiricahua band that had lived peacefully in the hidden valley for generations. Her people had done nothing wrong except exist in a place where white men wanted to build their railroad. The logging operation that followed was systematic and cruel. Webb's men cut down every ancient oak and pine that had sheltered her ancestors, stripping the sacred land bare. They built a temporary camp where her village once stood, using the cleared timber to construct barracks and a mill. Every tree that fell felt like another piece of her soul being torn away. For weeks, Ayanna had watched from the surrounding hills as they destroyed her homeland. She survived on whatever she could forage, moving constantly to avoid the patrols that searched for her. Webb had put a bounty on her head, claiming she was a dangerous savage who posed a threat to his operation. The truth was simpler and more terrifying: she was a witness to what he had done, and he could not afford to let her live. The sound of boots on gravel snapped her back to the present danger. 2 soldiers were climbing toward her hiding spot, their rifles ready. Ayanna had learned to move like a shadow these past months, but the rocky terrain offered little cover. She would have to run again, even though her strength was nearly gone. "Check behind those rocks," Johnson ordered one of the men. "The colonel wants her found today." Ayanna waited until they were almost upon her, then sprang from her hiding place like a startled deer. She heard shouts behind her as she scrambled up the steep slope, loose stones sliding under her worn moccasins. A gunshot rang out, the bullet striking the rock where her head had been seconds before. She ran with the desperate energy of someone who had nothing left to lose, weaving between boulders and jumping over fallen logs. Her long black hair streamed behind her, and her simple buckskin dress was torn and stained from months of living rough. Behind her, more voices joined the chase, and she could hear Webb himself shouting orders. The pursuit continued for hours through the unforgiving landscape of sagebrush and stone. Ayanna's knowledge of the land was all that kept her ahead of the mounted soldiers. She knew every hidden trail and secret water source, every cave that could offer temporary shelter. But she was weakening, and her pursuers had fresh horses and supplies. As the sun reached its peak, she found herself trapped on a narrow ledge high above the Gila River. The cliff face dropped away beneath her feet, while above, the rocks were too steep to climb. She could hear the soldiers approaching from behind, their voices triumphant now that they had cornered their prey. "End of the line, Apache," Webb called out as he appeared at the mouth of the ledge, his pale blue eyes cold with satisfaction. He was a tall man with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard, wearing the blue uniform of a cavalry officer. Behind him stood 6 armed men, their faces hard with the kind of casual cruelty that came from months of hunting another human being. Ayanna turned to face them, drawing herself up to her full height despite her exhaustion. She would not cower before these men who had murdered her family and destroyed her world. Her dark eyes blazed with defiance as she spoke in clear English. "You can kill me, but you cannot kill the truth of what you have done." Webb laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Truth? The only truth that matters is what gets written in the official reports. And those will say that a dangerous Apache renegade was killed while resisting arrest." He raised his pistol, taking careful aim. "Any last words, savage?" Before Ayanna could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Colonel." Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching along the ledge from the opposite direction. He sat tall in his saddle on a paint horse, wearing the simple clothes of a rancher, leather chaps, a worn hat, and a blue work shirt. His face was weathered by years of sun and wind, with kind gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. A Colt revolver rested casually in the holster at his side. "This is none of your concern, Garrett," Webb snarled, Ayanna noticed he lowered his weapon slightly. This woman is a fugitive from justice. The rancher, Garrett, dismounted slowly and walked closer, his movements calm and deliberate. Funny thing about justice, Colonel. I've been hearing some interesting stories from the folks in town about what really happened to that Apache village. Stories that don't quite match your official reports. Webb's face darkened. You'd take the word of ignorant settlers over a United States Army officer? I'd take the word of honest people over a liar any day, Garrett replied evenly. His hand rested near his gun, not threatening but ready. See, I've been asking questions about your logging operation. Turns out there's no official authorization for what you've been doing. No orders from Washington, no territorial permits. Just a private deal between you and some railroad investors. The silence stretched taut as the implications sank in. Ayanna watched this unexpected confrontation unfold, hardly daring to hope. Who was this man who would stand against armed soldiers to defend a stranger? That's a serious accusation, Webb said carefully, his eyes flicking between Garrett and his men. Do you have proof of these claims? Garrett smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I've got witnesses ready to testify, documents that show you're real investors, and a telegraph from the territorial governor asking some very pointed questions about unauthorized military actions. He paused, letting that sink in. Seems someone sent him copies of those reports you thought were buried. Webb's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he saw how calmly Garrett watched him. The rancher had the easy confidence of a man who had faced danger many times and lived to tell about it. More importantly, his story made sense of things that had been troubling people in the territory for months. Here's how this is going to work, Garrett continued, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone of steel. You and your men are going to ride away from here. You're going to stop hunting this woman, and you're going to start packing up your illegal operation. Because if you don't, I'm going to make sure every newspaper between here and Washington knows exactly what you've been up to. And if I refuse? Webb asked, though his bluster was fading. Garrett's smile became genuine, but somehow more dangerous. Then, we can settle this the old-fashioned way, right here and now. Your choice, Colonel. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty ledge. Ayanna held her breath, knowing that her life hung in the balance of this confrontation. She had given up hope of rescue long ago, resigned to dying on this cliff face far from the bones of her ancestors. Now, impossibly, salvation had arrived in the form of a stranger with kind eyes and a steady hand. Webb finally holstered his pistol, his face twisted with frustrated rage. This isn't over, Garrett. You have no idea what you're interfering with. Maybe not, the rancher agreed. But I know right from wrong, and what you've been doing to this woman is wrong. He gestured toward Ayanna without taking his eyes off the soldiers. She's under my protection now. Anyone who wants to harm her will have to go through me. The colonel's face went white with anger, but he knew he was beaten. Too many people were asking questions, and Garrett clearly had more support than just his own gun. Fall back, he ordered his men through gritted teeth. We'll settle this through proper channels. As the soldiers retreated, Garrett finally turned his full attention to Ayanna. She was swaying on her feet, exhaustion and relief overwhelming her now that the immediate danger had passed. He approached her slowly, his hands visible and empty, speaking in a gentle voice. It's all right, he said. You're safe now. My name is Thomas Garrett, and I own a ranch about 10 miles south of here. Would you like to come with me? You need food and rest, and I promise you'll be safe on my land. Ayanna studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden cruelty. She had learned not to trust easily, but something in his eyes reminded her of her grandfather, a deep kindness that could not be faked. Slowly, she nodded. I am Ayanna, she said, her voice hoarse from thirst and fear. It means eternal bloom. Though there is little blooming in my life now. Garrett's expression softened with genuine sympathy. Maybe we can change that, he said gently. Everyone deserves a chance to bloom again. As he helped her mount his horse and they rode away from that terrible ledge, Ayanna wondered if she dared to hope for a future beyond mere survival. The gentle rancher had risked his life to save hers, but what would happen when they reached his ranch? Could she trust this kindness, or was it just another trap waiting to spring closed around her? The Arizona sun was setting as they rode toward an uncertain tomorrow, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded her of the sacred fires her people once built to welcome the night spirits. For the first time in months, Ayanna allowed herself to believe that perhaps not all white men were her enemies. Perhaps, in this harsh and unforgiving land, there was still room for mercy. The Garrett Ranch spread across a green valley like something from a dream Ayanna had forgotten she could have. As they rode through the wooden gate, she saw cattle grazing peacefully in fenced pastures, a vegetable garden flourishing beside a stone house, and horses moving freely in a large corral. After months of hiding in caves and sleeping on rocky ground, the sight of this organized, peaceful place made her throat tight with emotion. Thomas helped her down from the horse with careful respect, never touching her more than necessary. "Martha," he called toward the house, and Ayanna tensed, wondering what kind of woman would emerge. She had learned to fear white women as much as their men, having seen how quickly they could turn cruel when they looked at someone like her. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple blue dress covered by a flour-dusted apron, and her weathered hands spoke of years of hard work. But her eyes were warm as she looked at Ayanna, showing concern rather than the disgust or fear she had come to expect. "Thomas, what have you brought home now?" Martha asked, but her tone was gentle, almost amused. She walked toward them with a slight limp, favoring her left leg. "This is Ayanna," Thomas said simply. "She needs help." That was apparently all the explanation Martha needed. She looked at Ayanna's torn clothing, her thin frame, and the exhaustion written in every line of her body, then nodded briskly. "Come on then, dear. Let's get you fed and cleaned up." Ayanna hesitated at the threshold of the house, memories of the last time she had been inside a white person's dwelling flashing through her mind. It had been a trading post where she and her cousin had gone to exchange beadwork for supplies, only to be cheated and called names that still burned in her memory. Martha seemed to understand her reluctance. "I know it's frightening," she said quietly. "But you're safe here. We don't have much, but what we have, we share freely." Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. Handmade furniture filled rooms that smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. Quilts covered the chairs, and wildflowers sat in mason jars on the windowsills. It felt like a real home, not the cold, impersonal spaces she had seen in military compounds. Martha led her to a small room at the back of the house. "This was our daughter's room," she explained, pain flickering briefly across her face. "She would have been about your age now. You can stay here as long as you need." The room contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a wooden dresser, and a small window that looked out on the garden. Clean clothes were folded on the bed, a simple brown dress and undergarments that looked like they would fit reasonably well. "There's soap and water in the basin," Martha continued. "Take your time getting cleaned up, then come to the kitchen when you're ready. Thomas will want to hear your story, but only if you're comfortable sharing it." When Martha left, closing the door gently behind her, Ayanna sank onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. For the first time since the attack on her village, she allowed herself to truly feel the weight of her grief and exhaustion. Tears came in a flood, 3 months of suppressed emotion pouring out in silent sobs that shook her entire body. She washed carefully in the basin, watching months of dirt and fear swirl away in the soapy water. The borrowed dress fit well enough, though it felt strange after so long in her traditional buckskin. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser, she saw a thin, hollow-eyed woman who looked older than her 22 years. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of beef stew and fresh cornbread. Thomas sat at a wooden table, having cleaned up and changed into fresh clothes. He stood when she entered, gesturing to a chair across from him. "Please, sit," he said. "You must be hungry." Martha placed a steaming bowl before her along with a thick slice of cornbread dripping with butter. The first bite was like a revelation. She had been surviving on roots and berries for so long that she had forgotten what real food tasted like. She ate slowly, trying not to seem desperate despite her hunger. "Take your time," Thomas said gently. "There's plenty more." As she ate, he talked quietly about the ranch, explaining how he and Martha had built it up over 15 years of hard work. They raised cattle and horses, grew vegetables, and sometimes took in travelers who needed a place to stay. His voice was soothing, requiring no response from her, just letting her get used to being in a safe place again. When she finally set down her spoon, feeling more human than she had in months, Thomas leaned back in his chair and studied her with those kind gray eyes. "I heard about what happened to your village," he said quietly. "I want you to know that not everyone supported what Webb did. Many of us tried to stop it, but we didn't learn about it until it was too late." Ayanna looked up sharply. "You knew my people?" "I knew of them," Thomas replied. "Your band had a reputation for being peaceful. You traded fairly with the settlers and never caused trouble. What Webb did was murder, plain and simple, and he's going to answer for it." "How can you be so sure?" she asked, voicing the doubt that had been growing in her mind. "He is a colonel. You are one man." Thomas smiled grimly. "I'm not just one man. I have friends, ranchers, traders, even some honest soldiers who are disgusted by what Webb has been doing. We've been gathering evidence for weeks, waiting for the right moment to act." He explained how several local ranchers had been suspicious when the logging operation began without any official announcement. They had started asking questions, comparing notes, and slowly building a case against Webb and his illegal activities. "The territorial governor is already asking questions," Thomas continued. "Webb's been operating without authorization, using federal soldiers for private profit. That's a serious crime, even in a place as lawless as Arizona Territory." Martha sat down at the table with a cup of coffee, joining the conversation. "Thomas has been writing all over the territory, talking to people who knew your village. Everyone speaks well of your people." "They are all dead now," Ayanna said quietly, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "Speaking well of the dead changes nothing." "No," Thomas agreed solemnly. "But bringing their murderer to justice means something. And making sure their story is told truthfully means something too." Over the following days, Ayanna slowly began to believe that she might actually be safe in this place. Thomas and Martha treated her with consistent kindness, never making her feel like a burden or a charity case. They included her in daily tasks around the ranch, teaching her new skills while respecting the knowledge she already possessed. She helped Martha in the garden, sharing her knowledge of which wild plants were good for medicine and which were edible. In return, Martha taught her how to preserve vegetables and bake bread. The work was soothing, connecting her hands to the earth in a way that reminded her of better times. Thomas showed her how his cattle operation worked, and she was impressed by his fair treatment of the Mexican and Anglo workers who helped him. He paid good wages and treated everyone with respect, regardless of their background. Several of his workers spoke Spanish as well as English, and they made an effort to include her in their conversations. "Why are you helping me?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, carving a piece of wood with his pocket knife. "I had a daughter once," he said finally. "Emma. She was about your age when she died of fever 5 years ago. Sometimes I think about what I would want someone to do if she had been alone and in trouble." The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep in Ayanna's heart. She had been surrounded by so much cruelty for so long that she had almost forgotten that people could act from pure goodness. "I am sorry for your loss," she said softly. "And I'm sorry for yours," he replied. "But maybe we can help each other heal." As the weeks passed, news began filtering in from the outside world. A federal investigator had arrived in the territory to look into Webb's activities. Several newspapers were reporting on the story, prompted by information that Thomas and his allies had provided. The colonel's illegal logging operation was slowly being exposed to public scrutiny. But Webb was not going quietly. Reports reached the ranch that he was still actively searching for Ayanna, claiming she was a dangerous fugitive who posed a threat to innocent settlers. He had even increased the bounty on her head, hoping to tempt bounty hunters into taking up the chase. "He knows that as long as you're alive, you're a witness to what he did," Thomas explained. "Your testimony could send him to prison, maybe even get him hanged for murder." The thought terrified Ayanna, but it also gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since the night her village burned. For the first time, she began to consider the possibility of fighting back instead of just hiding. "What would I have to do?" she asked. Thomas looked at her seriously. "Eventually, you'd have to testify before a federal court about what you saw. It would mean facing Webb again, answering questions from lawyers who might not believe you. It won't be easy." "Nothing about my life has been easy," Ayanna replied with growing determination. "But, if it means justice for my people, then I will do what I must." Martha reached over and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to decide right now. Take your time to think about it." That night, Ayanna lay in the small bedroom that had become her refuge, staring up at the ceiling and thinking about courage. She had survived for months by being careful and avoiding confrontation. But survival wasn't the same as living, and living meant sometimes taking risks for something greater than yourself. Outside her window, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing softly, horses moving in their pasture, the distant call of an owl. These were peaceful sounds, the sounds of a place where life continued its ancient rhythms without fear or violence. She thought about her grandmother's stories of women warriors who fought to protect their people, and her grandfather's teachings about the responsibility that came with being the last witness to great wrongs. If she stayed hidden forever, Webb would escape justice and might even hurt others. But if she found the courage to speak out, she might honor the memory of everyone she had lost. As dawn broke over the mountains, Ayanna made her decision. She would testify, she would face her fears, and she would make sure the world knew what had really happened to her people. The gentle rancher and his wife had given her more than just shelter, they had helped her remember who she was supposed to be. The last Apache woman standing would not remain silent. The federal courthouse in Tucson buzzed with nervous energy as people gathered for what everyone knew would be the most important trial in Arizona Territory's recent history. Ayanna sat in the front row between Thomas and Martha, wearing a new blue dress that Martha had sewn for the occasion. Her long black hair was braided with silver ribbons, and she held her head high despite the curious and sometimes hostile stares from the packed gallery. Word had spread throughout the territory that the sole survivor of the Apache massacre would finally tell her story. Newspaper reporters had come from as far away as San Francisco and Chicago, eager to cover a story that had captured the nation's attention. The territorial governor himself was in attendance, along with several high-ranking military officials who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Colonel Webb sat at the defendant's table with his lawyers, still wearing his uniform despite having been stripped of his command pending the investigation. He kept glancing at Ayanna with undisguised hatred, as if he could silence her with the force of his stare alone. His face was thinner than when she had last seen him on that cliff ledge, the stress of the past months having taken its toll. Judge Harrison Mackenzie, a stern man with white whiskers and piercing blue eyes, called the court to order. The charges against Webb were serious of murder, conspiracy, theft of government property, and conducting unauthorized military operations for personal profit. If convicted, he could face the death penalty. "This case has attracted considerable attention," Judge Mackenzie began, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded courtroom. "But I want to make it clear that we are here to determine the facts, not to satisfy public curiosity. Justice will be served based on evidence and testimony, nothing more." The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. Thomas had helped gather witnesses from across the territory, ranchers who had seen the unauthorized logging operation, traders who had noticed the sudden absence of Ayanna's people from local markets, and even some of Webb's own soldiers who had grown disgusted with what they were ordered to do. Sergeant James Sullivan, a weathered career soldier with 20 years of service, took the stand with obvious reluctance. He had served under Webb for 3 years and clearly struggled with testifying against his former commander. "Tell the court what you witnessed on the night of June 15th, the prosecutor instructed. Sullivan's voice was barely above a whisper. "We attacked the Apache village without warning, sir. No attempts at negotiation, no orders to surrender. The colonel said we were dealing with hostiles, but..." He paused, swallowing hard. "They weren't fighting, sir. They were sleeping. Women, children, old people. It was a massacre." The defense attorney, a slick-haired man from Denver, tried to discredit Sullivan's testimony, suggesting he was disgruntled after being passed over for promotion. But the sergeant's obvious anguish at having to relive that night made his words ring true. More witnesses followed, each adding another piece to the terrible picture of that night. Dr. Samuel Hendricks, the town physician, testified about treating the bullet wound of a soldier who had been accidentally shot by one of his own men during the attack. The soldier had been drunk and, bragging about shooting some Apache squaw who tried to run, details that painted Webb's claims of a legitimate military action as lies. Martha squeezed Ayanna's hand as the testimony grew more difficult to hear. "You don't have to listen to all of this," she whispered. "We could step outside." But Ayanna shook her head. She needed to hear every word, needed to understand exactly what had happened to her people. For months, she had only fragments of memory from that terrible night, the smell of smoke, the sound of screaming, the sight of flames consuming everything she had ever known. Now, piece by piece, the full picture was emerging. On the second day of the trial, it was finally her turn to take the stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as she walked to the witness chair, her moccasin feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She had insisted on wearing traditional Apache clothing for her testimony, a doeskin dress decorated with beadwork that Martha had helped her make, using patterns Ayanna remembered from watching her grandmother. The prosecutor, a young man named David Williams who had traveled from Washington specifically for this case, approached her with obvious respect. "Please state your name for the court." "I am Ayanna of the Chiricahua people," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It means eternal bloom in your language. And, you were present in your village on the night of June 15th? "I was." Ayanna's hands were steady as she began to tell her story, but Thomas could see the pain in her dark eyes as she relived that night. She described waking to gunshots and screams, seeing soldiers shooting into teepees where families were sleeping, watching her grandmother fall as she tried to protect the children. "Did you see Colonel Webb that night?" Williams asked. "Yes. He was giving orders, telling his men to burn everything. When my cousin tried to surrender, holding up his hands to show he was unarmed, Webb shot him himself." Her voice never wavered, but tears ran silently down her cheeks. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned every detail of her story, suggested that her memory might be confused by trauma and grief, and implied that she was lying to get revenge against innocent soldiers who were just doing their duty. "Isn't it true that your people had been raiding settlements?" he demanded. "That they were known to be hostile to white settlers?" Ayanna looked at him steadily. "My people traded with the settlements. We lived in peace. We harmed no one. But, you have reason to hate all white people now, don't you? Reason to want revenge?" For the first time, Ayanna's composure cracked slightly. She looked out at the courtroom, seeing the faces of people who had come to watch her testimony like it was entertainment. Some looked sympathetic, others hostile, and many simply curious about the exotic Apache woman. Then, her eyes found Thomas and Martha, sitting in the front row with encouraging smiles on their faces. Behind them sat several other ranchers who had supported her, Mexican workers from Thomas's ranch, and even Dr. Hendricks, who had treated her when she first arrived in Tucson. Not all white people were her enemies. "I have reason to want justice," she said finally. "Justice for my people, and for all innocent people who are murdered by men like Colonel Webb. But I do not want revenge against all white people, because I have learned that not all white people are the same." Her testimony continued for hours, interrupted frequently by objections from the defense and clarifying questions from the prosecution. She described the months of hiding, the constant fear, and the way Webb's men had hunted her like an animal. Through it all, she maintained her dignity and composure, speaking with quiet authority about things that would have broken lesser spirits. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, there wasn't a sound in the courtroom except for the scratching of reporters' pencils as they frantically scribbled notes. Her testimony had been devastating to Webb's case, but, more than that, it had revealed the human cost of his actions in a way that statistics and military reports never could. The trial continued for another week, with the defense calling character witnesses for Webb and trying to argue that he had been operating under legitimate military authority. But the evidence was overwhelming, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. During the closing arguments, Webb's attorney made a final desperate attempt to discredit Ayanna's testimony. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you're being asked to take the word of a savage against that of a decorated United States Army officer. This woman admits to hating white people. Can you really trust her version of events?" The prosecutor's response was measured but powerful. "Gentlemen, you are being asked to choose between truth and lies, between justice and corruption. Ayanna has no reason to lie, she has already lost everything. Colonel Webb has every reason to lie, his life depends on it. The evidence is clear, the witnesses are credible, and justice demands that you hold this man accountable for his crimes." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim but determined. Judge Mackenzie called the court to order and asked for their verdict. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in noise, some cheering, others shouting protests, reporters rushing for the doors to file their stories. Through it all, Ayanna sat quietly between Thomas and Martha, feeling a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the dead. Webb's face had gone white as the additional guilty verdicts were read: conspiracy, theft, conducting unauthorized military operations. Judge Mackenzie sentenced him to death by hanging, a sentence that would be carried out in 30 days. As the crowd began to disperse, Webb was led away in chains. He stopped directly in front of Ayanna, his guards allowing him this final moment. "You think you've won," he said quietly, his voice filled with venom. "But there are others like me. This territory isn't big enough for both our people, and we both know which side has the guns." Ayanna looked at him with something approaching pity. "You are wrong," she said simply. "This territory is big enough for people who choose to live in peace. You could never understand that because you chose hate instead." Webb was dragged away, still muttering threats and curses. Ayanna watched him go, feeling the last of her fear drain away. For months, this man had haunted her dreams and ruled her days through terror. Now he was just a broken, defeated figure being led to his fate. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded her, shouting questions and asking for statements. Thomas and Martha flanked her protectively, helping her through the crowd to their wagon. But, before they could escape, one reporter's question stopped her. "Miss Ayanna, what will you do now? Where will you go?" She turned to face the crowd of journalists, photographers, and curious onlookers. For a moment, she thought about her grandmother's words about speaking with the voice of truth, about the responsibility that came with survival. "I will go home," she said clearly. "To the ranch of Thomas and Martha Garrett, who showed me that not all white people are enemies. I will help them work their land, and I will remember my people by living the kind of life they would have wanted for me, a life of peace, not hatred." "But what about other Apache people? What message do you have for them?" Ayanna considered this carefully. "I would tell them what my grandfather taught me, that strength comes not from how hard you can strike back, but from how well you can heal and rebuild. The white people who destroyed my village were evil. But the white people who saved me are good. We must learn to tell the difference." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the hill that looked down into the green valley where Thomas and Martha had built their life, Ayanna felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of coming home. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Martha asked gently. "You could go anywhere now. There might be other Apache people you could find, other tribes who would take you in." Ayanna thought about this as they approached the familiar wooden gate. She could seek out distant relatives, try to rebuild some version of her old life. Or she could stay here, in this place where she had learned to feel safe again, with these people who had risked everything to protect her. "My people believe that home is not a place," she said finally. "Home is where you are loved and where you can love others in return. I have found that here." As they pulled up to the house, she saw that several of the ranch hands had gathered to welcome them back. Their faces were warm with genuine affection, and she realized that somewhere along the way, without her noticing, she had become part of this strange, wonderful family that Thomas and Martha had created. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains in its daily display of gold and crimson, Ayanna sat on the porch with a cup of Martha's coffee and watched the cattle moving peacefully in their pastures. Tomorrow, she would help with the harvest, work in the garden, and continue building the quiet, steady life she had discovered was possible even after losing everything. She thought about her people often, but the memories no longer brought only pain. Now they brought gratitude for the lessons they had taught her, the strength they had given her, and the love that could never be taken away even by death. Colonel Webb had tried to destroy her by taking everything she cared about, but he had failed to understand the most important thing about the human spirit: it could always bloom again, even in the harshest ground. The last Apache woman had found her way home.